Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 5. We'll present about Orientalism. I will introduce ourselves first. My name is LATIFA AFIANI and my partner's name is NAJWA AHDA Nur Fajrin, NADHIROTUL UMMAH, PUTRI Dwi RAHAYU, and RAHMI HANUM. In this video, we will explain about definition of Orientalism, characteristic of Orientalism, scope of Orientalism, structure and restructure Orientalism, and the last is Orientalism now.
Orientalism. Orientalism is the study of Near and Far Eastern society and cultures, language, and peoples by Western scholars. It can also refer to the imitation or the vision of aspects of Eastern culture in the West by writer, designer, and artists. Orientalism derives from a Latin word is Orient and the meaning is it or literary rising sun. This is the opposite of the term Occident. In terms of the Old World, Europe was considered to be the West or Occidental, and the furthest known extremity was the East or the Orient. Orientalism refers to the Western imitation or depiction of certain characteristics and aspects of Middle Eastern and Asian cultures. The history of Orientalism. At the beginning of the emergence of Orientalism, it is not known for the certain who first gave rise to this science. But officially, the emergence of Orientalism was established in the Church of Vienna. After that, there is Edward Said, and Edward Said was born on November 1st, 1935 in Jerusalem, Palestine. He is the son of Mariam Said and Mary Janus, and he was a Palestine-American intellectual who laid the foundation of the theory. Then Edward published his successful book entitled Orientalism, 1978. Next is the example of Orientalism. The first is Aladdin. Since the film's release in November of 1992 by Walt Disney Pictures, Aladdin has become one of Disney's most successful films to date, being ranked as the fourth highest film based on popularity. Unfortunately, the film has long been criticized for its unfair portrayal of the Arab world and is one of the more widely known examples of modern Orientalism still present in Western society today. The second is The Adventure of Tintin. This series of comics created by Belgian cartoonist Georges Remy, and the comics were published in French for 1929 until 1976. The hero and main character is Tintin, who is young Belgian journalist. Written in 20th century Europe, the story plots usually were written by Remy with a goal of realistically representing events and ideas of the 19th century.
Okay, the next one is about characteristic of Orientalism. There are three characteristic of Orientalism. The first one is textual construct of the Orient. One of the key Orientalism characteristic is the European textual representation of the colonial Orient. It's mean that the texts they include is like the novel, travel books, letter, manuscript, a document, and other various textual remain of the material cultural. These texts were based on the assumption that Europeans had drawn about the Eastern culture. In addition to the Western assumption that there is a distinct absence of what the actual inhabited had to say. These textual discourses allow a retrospective view of the political, social, and cultural relationship and situation that exist in the post-colonial era. The second one is distinguish Occidental and Oriental culture. This is linked to the first characteristic of Orientalism, wherein the term of Occident is used to define the Western culture. Edward said that he is argued that there existed a negative inversion between the two concepts, where the Orient is the categorized as opposite of the good Western in culture. There is a formation of a myth wherein the proto- prototypical Orient is the view as extreme, backward, sensual, and passive. It is progress in comparison with the Occidental culture was always inferior and congruable. And the last one is about power relation. Edward said that defined the power relation between the two culture as the relation of the West and the Orient was the relationship of power and of complicated dominance. According to Edward, Edward said, the relationship of the power excited as political, intellectual, cultural, and the moral power. This power relation is said to be flowing first between the myths and supposition surrounding the Oriental culture. The discourse were created and employed by the Western colonial power to dominate, restructure, and control the Orient.
Next is the scope of Orientalism. The basis of this statement about Orientalism and this scope that is branch of the argument put forward by Edward Said lies in the concept of power and knowledge, which is shown in the Prime Minister's speech Arthur Balfour in 1910 regarding the concept of knowledge and also the domination of Western society in England against Egypt's civilization. Below is the content of his speech. However, that speech only leads to the description of colonialism under the guise of Orientalism and close the representation of the identity of Orientalism itself without being showed its link of Orientalism to European. Then it led the focus of Said analysis to provide by what he sees as the close link between the upsurge in Orientalism and the rise in European imperial dominance during the 19th century. The political orientation of his analysis can be seen by the importance he gives to Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. Napoleon tactics that shown how Orientalism should be in Egypt invasion persuading the Egyptian population that he was fighting on behalf of Islam rather than against it. utilizing as he did all the available knowledge of the Quran and Islamic society that could be mastered by French scholars and comprehensively demonstrate the strategic and tactical power of knowing.
The next is Orientalist structure and restructure. Edward Said explained that this Orientalist was a shift in the attitude of the West towards the East in modern times, namely the change in the 18th century to 19th and 20th century Orientalism. Said argues this happened because of the expansion beyond the lands of Islam throughout the East, the increased understanding of Oriental history, the perceived connection in the history of East and West, and the drive to classify nature and humans into types. These elements secularized Orientalism, and in return they led to imperialism and colonialism. Said argues that modern Orientalists are the product of an accumulation of surviving ideas, not because they are grounded in reality, but because they exist in the first place and appear to be supported by secular authorities. The two Orientalists on whom Said was based were Sylvestre de Sacy and Ernest Renan. They emphasized that part of the strength of the Orientalist worldview was the ideological self-preservation as religious approach to 17th and early 18th century Orientalism allowed imperial and colonial policies. Scientific approach to late 18th century Orientalism and beyond to dictate public policy in the world is. Said's view of the relationship between East and West is one based on a religious framework. Original texts about the East, such as Dante's Inferno and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, were religious. Later works on the East are also religious, framed as pilgrimage, and those inherently personal and subjective. Therefore, it was this religion that influenced the conquest of Islam to become a moral obligation, which was then perpetuated throughout the history of Orientalism.
So the next material is about Orientalism now. I am Putri RAHAYU and I will explain about it. Before we gonna move to the material, I just want to remind you that Orientalism itself contained two sides. The first is Orient, which is East people, and the second is Occident, which is West people. Like Edward Said said, Orientalism is devoted to exploring the most recent, for Said time, development in Orientalism and the manner in which the Orient was perceived and treated by the Occident. European colonialism was the geographical basis of Orientalism, both in geopolitical and cultural aspect. Orientalism and colonialism were both driven by quest for knowledge and power, and their result and product were knowledge and power too. So I can say that European colonialism is one of the cause Orientalism happened at the time. So, what the difference between Orientalism now and then? The Orientalism of today, both in its sensibility and in its manner of production, is not quite the same as the Orientalism Edward Said discussed 40 years ago. Since the book first published in 1978, Orientalism has become one of those words that shut down conversation on liberal campus, where no one wants to be accused of being Orientalist any more than they want to be called racist, sexist, homophobic, or transphobic. It's happened because men adapt
in this book was to portray Islam as a weak and inferior religion. And as we know that most of Islamic people come from its side. And when this book published 40 years ago, there was happened some cruel incident in the East. One of them is Camp David occurs between Israel, Egypt, and Lebanon's Civil War. So that's why some people at the time which from its area didn't want to call it Oriental and prefer call it with vulgarization words like I said before. In the 20th century, politics between East and West has been changed. One of the main differences in the 20th century is that Orientalists became much more involved in the everyday life of Oriental, unlike their predecessors who were uninvolved observers. It meant that the people studying non-Western culture attempted to live and integrate with them, like Lawrence of Arabia book. This was not driven by a wish to resemble the Orients, but rather by a wish to gain more knowledge about them and rule them better. It happened in the European. Orientalism in US is quite different with the Orientalism in European. Orientalism in US was related to social science. Orientalism as a field of study was aimed to assist the government in finding ways to control non-Western societies. The colonization process following World War II did not mean the end of the Orientalism, which was made implicit instead of explicit. Even in the age of globalization and higher interaction between East and West, Arab are all the terrorists. So I can conclude the difference between them that Orientalism then they focus to learn how to control non-Western people. But the Orientalism now is the style to learn culture through based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction between the Orient and the Occident. Ontological itself is the branch of philosophy that studies the nature of human being existence as individual in society and universe. And epistemological is the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge or knowing.